nightgown clinging to her ripe flesh, abdomen balanced on the rail, body flexed like a bow, as if she were an aerialist in mid-flight. Her arms flailed, her eyes screwed shut, her mouth issued gargles of incoherent terror. A more distant flash of lightning briefly revealed the silhouette of a man standing behind Mrs. Chase, holding onto her feet. Then the heavens erupted in pale fire. Thunderbolts spiked and interwove, a chandelier of the gods that would set the entire ocean ablaze. And she saw the man's face. Lynn. A numb shock singed every last one of her nerve endings, so that she was cold and burning at once. The man should be dead. He had been beheaded years ago, hadn't he? She wiped the rain from her eyes, but he was still there, the murderer of her child. He was still there. Sometimes she could no longer recall her infant daughter's exact features, but always she remembered the warmth of holding the baby close, the awe that she should have been given such a wonderful child, until she was sobbing over the baby's lifeless body with nothing in her heart but despair and hatred. A dagger from her vambrace hissed through the air, the sound of its flight lost in the thunder that rent her ears. But he heard. He jerked his head back at the last possible second, the knife barely missing his nose. Darkness. The ship listed sharply starboard. Mrs. Chase's copious flesh hit the deck with a thud and a splash. Catherine threw herself down as two sleeve arrows shot past her. The steamer crested a swell and plunged into the hollow between waves. She allowed herself to slide forward on the smooth planks of the walkway. A weak lightning at the edge of the horizon offered a fleeting glow, enough for her to see his outline. She pushed off the deck and, borrowing the ship's own downward momentum, leaped toward him, one knife in each hand. He threw a large object at her. She couldn't see, but it had to be Mrs. Chase. There was nothing else of comparable size nearby. She flipped the knives around in her palms and caught Mrs. Chase, staggering backward. The ship began its laborious climb up another huge swell. She set Mrs. Chase down and let the small river on deck wash them both toward the door. She had to get Mrs. Chase out of the way to kill him properly. More sleeve arrows skimmed the air currents. She ducked one and deflected another from the back of Mrs. Chase's head with the blade of a knife. She kicked open the door. Sending both of her knives his way to buy a little time, she dragged Mrs. Chase's inert, uncooperative body inside. A match flared before Mrs. Reynolds's face, a stark chiaroscuro of anxious eyes and blooded cheeks. As Catherine set Mrs. Chase down on the wet carpet, Mrs. Reynolds, who should have stayed in her corner, docilely suffering, found the strength to get up, push the door shut, and bolt it. "No!" shouted Catherine. She preferred to fight outside, where there were no helpless women underfoot. Almost immediately the door thudded. Mrs. Reynolds yelped and dropped the match, which fizzled on the sodden carpet. Catherine grabbed the matchbox from her, lit another one, stuck it in Mrs. Reynolds's hand, and wrapped a long scrap of dressing gown around her head. "Don't worry about Mrs. Chase. She'll have bumps and bruises, but she'll be all right." Mrs. Reynolds gripped Catherine's hand. Thank you for saving her." The match burned out. Another heavy thump came at the door. The mooring of the deadbolt must be tearing loose from the bulkhead. She tried to pull away from Mrs. Reynolds, but the latter would not let go of her. "I cannot allow you to put yourself in danger for us again, Miss Blade. We will pray and throw ourselves on God's mercy." Crack. Thump. Crack. Impatiently, she stabbed her index finger into the back of Mrs. Reynolds's wrist. The woman's fingers fell slack. Catherine rushed forward and kicked at the door. It was in such a poor state now that it could be forced out, as well as in. As she drew back to gather momentum, he rammed the door once more. A flash of lightning lit the crooked edge.